Good morning and welcome to American Renaissance X Office Hours. We're here from the Jones Media Center in the Innovation Studio at Dartmouth College. I'm here with Professors Don Pease and Jed Dobson to address some of your questions on the message boards. So we'll start with a question that I found, it's really my question.
Sure.
But a student had an interesting comment about Ishmael being sort of an omniscient perspective, being able to look at scenes in Moby Dick in sort of a meta perspective and a very intellectual way. And Huck being more of a naive narrator, kind of taking things as they come. But to me it seemed like maybe Huck is just as intelligent and worldly as Ishmael, that he can see things from every perspective. He just allows the scenes to wash over him, and his narrative comes from just his reflections on those scenes. Do we think that Huck is really that naive, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I can see, I know in our residential version of this class, we had several students very interested in comparing these narrators, right? It seems like an obvious pairing, right? Think about Ishmael and Huck Finn. Huck's voice is, I think, pretty unique in American literature. We see something new. I mean, in the opening passages here of the text, he speaks in first person. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter, right? And then he introduces, that book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, right, the author, and he told the truth mainly. It's a completely new voice, and I think there's probably a couple different ways we could approach the differences in the question of naivete in the characters. Huck Finn's a child. He's an adolescent, right? And Ishmael's much older person who has already gone to sea before, has had a life. So there's an age difference between them. And I think that's something that Twain's trying to get at with this youthful narrator. There's also a class difference, right? There's the suggestion, I know you brought this up in your reading, very small reference to Ishmael being a former teacher, right? And there's certainly a class difference, right? Ishmael goes to sea not for money, although it's nice to get money, right? He doesn't want to be just a passenger. Huck is a low class figure, right? So he's young, he's low class. There's also a generic difference between the two texts that might be contributing to some of the differences that we see. The high perspectives, right, that we're getting with Ishmael, that seems to me, I would come at that and thinking about this question as the generic question of romanticism, that romanticism, 19th century romanticism, would be interested in sort of the distant view, the metaphysical questions we get in the romantic poetry, right? These large vistas, right? The mountainous views, we get distance on the self, and these big questions. Later in the 19th century, when Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was written and published, long period, we're drifting into realism, into an interest in minute detail, in lower perspective. So if we have Ishmael up in the top mast of the boat, here we're going to get Huck Finn right down on the raft, reporting on things that he's seeing, and that's going to contribute to some of the difference in narration. Georg Lukács describes this, the two different modes that are happening at this time in realistic and naturalist fiction as narration and description, which is going to tell us narration about the what we call the picaresque plot of the trip down the river. Right? These are the events as they're happening, action-oriented description. Here are things in the world that our narrator is seeing. And there's tone, of course, too. This is much more humor, right? Although I think Moby Dick's not appreciated as humorous a novel as it really is. But we're getting that, a lot of humor here. And I think Twain's playing with that. So the question of naivete, is Huck naive. Twain's playing with that. He's playing with the perspective differences, our expectations of the low-class character of a child and what they'd see. I mean, we get some of the most ignorant and some of the most profound statements from Huck, I think. He is able to say both. He's at times disappears like Ishmael, and Ishmael's voice leaves the novel. We also see the character of Huck replaced entirely with someone else every time he goes on land in a way. The last part of the novel when he becomes Tom Sawyer, there's also that maybe.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of comparable to Ishmael's obsession with Ahab. Like, whenever Ishmael's talking about Ahab, you completely lose Ishmael. But when Huck's on land, you completely lose Huck.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good transitional point. The first, 28 chapters of Moby Dick could be called Ishmael chapters. We have Ishmael, the narrator, who's also the participant. But the moment we encounter Ahab, Melville turns Ishmael into a figure who's simultaneously participating in the action, but also observing an action whose eventfulness exceeds his capacity either to participate or reliably to account for. That's when Melville shifts into the presentation of Shakespearean dramas, and Ishmael becomes the instrument for Melville to undergo that shift. But there's an even more dramatic distinction between Ishmael, the actor, participant, narrator, and the role that he's to play at the conclusion of Moby Dick. His name really isn't Ishmael. No member of the crew addresses him as Ishmael. He takes on the name Ishmael in order to demarcate the persona he needs to assume in order to perform the task that is assigned him in the epilogue. I alone have survived, he tells us, to pass on this tale. So Ishmael ceases to be a narrator, actor. He ceases to be an instrument by means of which Melville stages America's way of transforming the deepest inheritance from Europe, Shakespeare, into a drama of its own. And he also becomes a means whereby America can become appraised of what could become the consequences of the epic romance it's written about itself up to that point. On the other hand, as Professor Dobson has already pointed out, Huckleberry Finn is simultaneously a narrator, but because of the vernacular, because of the position of which you, I think, rightly have called naivete, it's also the means whereby Mark Twain makes his voice resonate through Huckleberry Finn's as an implied narrator, as an implied author, so that the narration of Huckleberry Finn is simultaneously a narration in which Huckleberry Finn is coming to terms with what's happening in his life according to his own very practical and very savvy, let's call it adolescent wisdom, at the same time as we see, and we see it starkly in two moments, that Mark Twain is, through Huckleberry Finn, staging the bankruptcy of the romance's capacity to come to terms with events that the American romance may have itself been partly responsible for producing. The moment at the conclusion in which the true emancipation of Jim has to undergo romance in order to, a romance burlesque, in order to become recognizable to the American readers who want romance even after the Civil War, instead of what Jed's called realism. And then the other remarkable moment in which Huckleberry Finn, in the moment of decision, says, all right then, I'll go to hell, meaning I'll violate every moral code I've internalized and refuse to sell Jim back into slavery. It's in those two moments in which we get the sense of the voice of Mark Twain speaking through the adolescent wisdom of Huckleberry Finn in order to disclose how this figure, Huckleberry Finn, is simultaneously speaking our greatest truths and revealing what may be in need of revision in
so
those truths.
You think it's a little more artful than Stowe? I mean, we definitely see Twain making fun of Stowe in kind of a satirical way with the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons. I think those are their names. So Twain, I feel like he's making a poke at Stowe and like saying, well, your entire novel was a minstrel show, and then he kind of does the same thing. So is it any better than Stowe?
I think that's a very good question, and since the backdrop for this particular session is the Mark Twain house, and in the edX course, we described that house as Mark Twain's act of displacing the Harriet Beecher Stowe house, as if it were a kind of Civil War march against her position in Hartford, but also her position in American literature. Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn after the Civil War. And the great power of Uncle Tom's Cabin was that it became a causative historical force that, as Abraham Lincoln indicated, was in part responsible for mobilizing the nation into antithetical positions in which only war, rather than rhetoric, could become the means of resolution. In order for her to do that, she had to construct stereotypes that engaged the deepest dimensions of our emotional, affective response. Let's call them apparatuses. She had to regress us to positions in which our capacity to sympathize and to identify became as clear as possible. When little Eva became literally that instrument for regressive change in the name of cultural transformation, when her relationship with Tom and then her death in the name of the emancipation, not just of Tom, but of all slaves, became the key turning point in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Mark Twain, writing after the effects of that novel, namely the Civil War, had brought about not only transformation, the emancipation of the slaves, but a nation that was still in a state of recovery. He had to return to her narrative instruments for producing the mentality that made war necessary and try to work through them, act out and work through the traumatizing power of those figures. So little Eva, who is over-idealized in Uncle Tom's Cabin, becomes Emmeline Grangerford in Huckleberry Finn, where Emmeline Grangerford needs the deaths in order to produce the odes in which mourning becomes so linked to militancy that you cannot recognize any distinction between the two. But Mark Twain also had to go to what he understood to be the deepest paradox produced by the Civil War, namely the fact that the war, which was justified in the name of the emancipation of slaves, had resulted, the time that he publishes Huckleberry Finn, in the production of Jim Crow conventions in the South, and in the North, an even more self-righteous form of racism. So instead of emancipation, emancipation became the pretext for the introduction of a racist mentality that Twain had to disclose in the final scenes of Huckleberry Finn by demonstrating to the reading public that had in the adventures of Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, expected a deeply redemptive result, he had to stage the burlesque of freeing an already free man to suggest that that burlesque of emancipation is what Reconstruction had dramatized after the Civil War as the condition of race relations in the United States, that he felt that Uncle Tom's Cabin was in part responsible for having sedimented.
I feel like Stowe comes at slavery from a place of like, from a racist place. It's like, we can only work through this question at a distance. I'm probably fumbling over my words here a little bit.
Would you say it was racist, or I think it's that's certainly what some writers have said. That's certainly what James Baldwin suggests, that she's constructed racist stereotypes. But in her explanation of, for example, the construction of Uncle Tom, she says she saw him in a vision in church after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, and she didn't see him as a stereotype. She saw Uncle Tom as the return of the figure of the Christ in the United States, in order to demonstrate how only the suffering and crucifixion and death of a figure who was for her an imitation of Christ could result in the transfiguration that could redeem the nation.
But it seems like Twain takes you directly to the question and makes you face it head on. He puts you on the raft with Jim.
He puts you on the raft with Jim in a way that is different from being in the parlor with little Eva and Uncle Tom. And you may be getting at the heart of why Twain produced that relation between Jim and Huck, because he wanted to show how Huck and Jim's relation was producing a true relation between equals. Although Huckleberry Finn is 14 and Jim is an adult man, and Huckleberry Finn tries to talk down to Jim, Jim is constantly disclosing to Huckleberry Finn that they share the same condition in the social order, being outcasts, and they have a bond of solidarity between them. Notice that when Huckleberry Finn is on the raft with Jim, he staged his death in order to enter into that outcast world. So you have a figure who staged his civil death, and you have a figure who's defined by the social order as civilly dead. And on that raft, they're creating, these two living dead men, a bond of relationality that is truly democratic. Whereas in the relationship between Uncle Tom and Eva, there seems to be, with Eva, the sense that even though she recognizes Tom's innocence and even his sanctity, she's still, in a sense, talking down to him, trying to elevate him into her evangel, into her gospel. And that isn't an equal relationship.
Yeah, I think that's what I was not artfully getting at.
I'm just a little slow at catching up with your artful insight.
Well, let's move on to some sort of bigger questions about the American Renaissance, since this will be our last office hours. We left out a lot of authors from this period, and I was wondering what excludes certain authors like Poe or Thoreau from the group that we've chosen.
So I'll start with this question. The basis of the course was the rubric created by F.O. Matheson. He had 5 major authors. You've mentioned or alluded to one that we left out, right? David Thoreau and Walden, just an excellent text, but given our time constraints and our interest in looking at the expanded canon, since that moment, we add 3 additional texts to that. So we removed one and added Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass, and Mark Twain. That enabled us to both expand the American Renaissance in terms of its representation by gender and class, the characters, as well as the authors, right? And to temporally expand the American Renaissance. F.O. Matheson is looking at this really 5-year period, 1850 to 1855, and we've been in American literary studies over the past handful of years thinking a lot about the ways in which ideas, thinking culturally comes into culture, how it emerges into it, and how it stays into it. So it is a formative moment for American literature, but there's texts that come earlier that we think, for instance, The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass, that are deeply informing what's happening at that formative 1850, 1855 moment. There's other texts like Adventures of Huckleberry Finn that are returning to that moment to take the question of what is an American literature, what does it mean to represent the United States at that moment, and expand it and rethink it. We've use the term Renaissance, I think, throughout the course to be both a moment of birth and a rebirth, right? We have turning points throughout the course that enable us to go back and look at this as something that's open-ended. As we add text, as we think about it, as we produce conversation with everyone, we are keeping this Renaissance moment alive. There's many texts that for time we had to leave out that I would love to have discussed with our students. I could name a huge list, right? There's so many. One thing that's wonderful about this moment, about this medium, right, the electronic medium, is that we have access to not only the novels that were printed, but the serialized stories, the slave narratives. There are thousands of slave narratives that were published at this time. There's early novels by African Americans. There's Native American literature. There's so much out there that I think the rubric and the understanding that we've organize this course around will enable you to go out and find these texts and think about how these authors, these ideas that they are investigating are linked to and take up some of the same questions. I think you can go to any author that you would have in mind and be able to plug it into this rubric.
I think that I really like that you said we've been using Renaissance as a term of both birth and rebirth, because I feel like this moment in American history was really the birth of American literature, not the rebirth. Mm-hmm. So I feel like maybe in the 20th century we may have experienced more of a renaissance. So I guess there seem to be a lot of novels in the mid-20th century that sort of return to this entire theme that we've been dealing with in this course.
And in fact, American literary studies emerged in the mid-20th century by returning to that moment in the middle of the 19th century in which the United States came into self-consciousness. That is, it liberated itself. It declared cultural independence from Europe in significant ways. In addition to the excellent points about the return to American Renaissance as a way of opening up rather than restricting an understanding of that specific moment in American literary history. I want to add the fact that we did this course in this way in order to demonstrate Dartmouth's relationship to the American Renaissance in the 19th century. That is, the fact that Ralph Waldo Emerson comes to Dartmouth in order to deliver the oration on literary ethics immediately after he establishes his identity by delivering the Divinity School and the American Scholar Address at Harvard. We turn to this particular moment in order to get students the sense that Caleb Bingham, who wrote the Columbian Orator, was deeply responsible for the organization of Frederick Douglass's autobiography. We return to this moment in order to show how Richard Chase, Dartmouth class of 1937, had taken F.O. Matthewson's vision of Hawthorne in American Renaissance and revised it to suit what he understood to be the needs of United States literary history in the mid-20th century. We turn to Quentin Anderson and his reading of The Imperial Self in Whitman in order to demonstrate how Dartmouth graduates and Dartmouth alums were recasting figures that Matheson had assigned specific roles in very different positions. And we also turn to the present repertoire of Dartmouth professors in the English department in the 21st century, including Ivy Schweitzer and Michael Cheney, and before them, James Melville Cox, to demonstrate the crucial roles that Dartmouth alums, faculty, and students play in revising the understanding of the American Renaissance in the 21st century. So the reason to returning to the American Renaissance wasn't to say that Matthewson's book is hyper-canonized or the texts that he has selected are the key texts. It was to demonstrate, let's call it the ongoing revisionary relationship with the American Renaissance in the 19th century as viewed through Matheson in 1941. So that perspective could become the location for a constant re-seeing, a constant transformation, both the lens and the reception of those figures in the 21st century, which is all to say that this course, the American Classics, is an ongoing work of rediscovery for which birth and rebirth can function as provisional metaphors. The American Renaissance moment is a moment that insists in the present as an occasion to rethink the past in a way that will give us resources for life as we proceed.
I think that's a great way to wrap up the course and to wrap up our office hours for today. So you have until April 12th to finish up all your work in Yellow Dig and Lacuna Stories, and have fun on the message boards. We'll see you there.
And thanks so much for taking this course. And Memory, it was a pleasure doing this with you. And Jed, I've learned so much from you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.